The highway stretched through the dense forest, a long, lonely ribbon of pavement cutting through the wilderness. The only sounds to break the stillness were the occasional passing car, the hum of tires against the asphalt, and the rustling of leaves stirred by the wind. The trees, towering and ancient, framed the road like silent sentinels, standing guard over the untamed lands beyond. It was a quiet stretch of highway, nestled far from the busy rush of city life. The kind of road people drove by without much thought, a mere passage between points. But on one fateful afternoon, the scene would change forever. Sarah, a woman whose heart was made of compassion and whose love for animals was unshakable, drove the same stretch of highway every day. She worked as a volunteer at a local wildlife rescue center, and on this particular day, her mind was distracted by thoughts of a recent tragedy in her life, the sudden passing of her partner. The pain of his loss had left a gaping hole in her heart, a void she didn't know how to fill. Animals, though, always seemed to soothe her. Their innocence, their loyalty, their unwavering trust in those who cared for them. It all reminded her that love and life still existed, even after loss. As Sarah's car moved along the road, her eyes wandered to the roadside. It was then that she saw them. At first, she thought they were merely shadows, tricking her eyes in the fading light. But as she slowed down and her heart quickened in her chest, the reality struck. There, lying on the side of the highway, were 6 bear cubs, small, vulnerable, and clearly abandoned. Their wide, scared eyes met hers, and Sarah's heart stopped. The cubs were huddled together for warmth, but their frail, trembling bodies and lack of movement told a grim story. They were alone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, her hands gripping the steering wheel, fighting the urge to panic. The cubs seemed so out of place in such an exposed area, far from any sign of their mother. She glanced around, trying to make sense of it all, but there were no signs of danger. No other animals, no tracks, just the cubs, abandoned on the cold concrete. She didn't think twice. She couldn't leave them. Sarah carefully stepped out of her car, closing the door softly behind her. The wind bit at her skin, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the bear cubs. The sight of them, so fragile and weak, tugged at her heart in a way she couldn't describe. These innocent creatures, likely orphaned or abandoned, needed help. The cubs looked up as she approached, their tiny bodies stiff with fear. They huddled together, trembling not just from the cold, but from the terror that clung to them. They had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves on the roadside, a fate that no wild animal, let alone helpless cubs, should ever endure. "Shh," Sarah whispered softly, crouching down to their level. Her voice was gentle, filled with care. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." She reached toward the cubs slowly, cautiously, making no sudden movements. The smallest cub, a golden little creature with fur so light it almost shone, was the first to approach her. Its eyes, wide with fear, softened slightly as Sarah's hand came closer. She carefully extended her hand to the cub, gently petting its fur. For a moment it seemed unsure, but as Sarah continued to offer comfort, the little cub made a tentative movement, allowing her to touch its head. She felt its soft fur beneath her fingers, warm, fragile, and so much smaller than she had imagined. Sarah's heart broke. These cubs were in desperate need of help, and she was determined to provide it. There was no question in her mind about what to do. She couldn't leave them here. Sarah carefully scooped up the cub in her arms, cradling it close to her chest. She was surprised at how light it was, its bones too delicate, its breathing too shallow. The other cubs hesitated at first, their instincts telling them to run, to hide, to remain in the safety of the group. But Sarah didn't push them. She waited patiently, offering soft words of reassurance, her voice carrying the weight of the compassion she felt. One by one, the cubs approached her, drawn by her warmth and her unwavering presence. She gently lifted them, one by one, into her arms, each of them small and fragile, needing care and protection. 6 cubs, each one a little soul who had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves in a world that didn't seem kind. By the time she had gathered them all, Sarah's heart was racing, her mind swirling with uncertainty. How had this happened? Who would leave such innocent creatures behind like this? She shook the thoughts away, focusing on what needed to be done now. The cubs were alive, and as long as they were alive, she could help them. She would help them. She carefully placed them in the back of her car, one by one, making sure they were all settled in as best as she could. She could feel their fear, their confusion, but they seemed to settle as the warmth of the car surrounded them. She could hardly bear to look at them. The image of those helpless little faces, abandoned on the side of the road, was already burned into her memory. As she drove back to her home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The cubs, though frightened and weak, were too calm. They didn't behave like typical wild bear cubs. They didn't fight to escape her arms, didn't struggle against her touch as wild animals often did. They seemed oddly receptive to her presence, almost as if they had been accustomed to human interaction before. A sinking feeling formed in Sarah's stomach. Something wasn't what it seemed. These cubs weren't just abandoned. They were part of a larger story, one that she was just beginning to understand. When Sarah finally arrived at her home, she carefully took the cubs inside, settling them in the living room. She immediately called the local wildlife rescue center, explaining the situation and asking for advice. But as she spoke to the rescue worker on the phone, something in her gut told her that the answers she needed wouldn't come easily. She stared at the cubs, now huddled together in a corner of the living room, their eyes half-lidded as they napped in the warmth of the fire. Their condition wasn't normal. They were too calm, too quiet for wild animals so young and vulnerable. She noticed the faint scent of something unusual in the air, a chemical smell she couldn't place. As Sarah paced around her house trying to organize her thoughts, she felt a pang of worry. What if these cubs weren't just abandoned? What if they were meant to be here for a reason she couldn't yet comprehend? She couldn't stop thinking about the mystery behind their abandonment, and that feeling deep in her heart that told her the cubs' story was far from over. Part 2. Unanswered Questions. Sarah sat by the cubs, her mind restless, her thoughts swirling in a haze of uncertainty. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm flickers of light across the room, but even the comforting glow couldn't soothe the unease growing inside her. The cubs, their tiny bodies nestled together on the rug, seemed so small, so fragile, and yet there was something in the way they sat, too still, too quiet, that left Sarah feeling unsettled. She paced the room, the events of the day replaying in her mind. The way she had found them on the highway, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The small, trembling cubs, their eyes full of fear, their bodies too weak to fend for themselves. The moment she had taken them in, the instinct to protect them had overwhelmed her. But now that the adrenaline had worn off, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. They were too calm. Bear cubs, especially wild ones, were typically full of energy, playfulness, and curiosity. These cubs had none of that. They had been abandoned, yes, but they didn't behave like typical wild bear cubs. They didn't struggle when she picked them up. Instead, they huddled close, as if they had been raised with humans before. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. These cubs weren't just lost in the wild. They were out of place, their story incomplete, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth. As night fell and Sarah settled onto the couch, the cubs continued to rest, their little bodies curled in the warmth of the house. Despite their earlier fatigue, the smallest cub, a dark brown one with soft fur, stirred and began to fidget. Sarah watched as the cub lifted its head, eyes wide and alert, its ears twitching at the sound of the wind outside. For a brief moment, it looked like the cub was about to run. Sarah stood up instinctively, worried that it might try to escape. But the cub simply turned its head and locked eyes with her. There was no panic, no fear in its gaze, just a calm, steady stare that seemed oddly intelligent for such a young creature. Sarah approached slowly, crouching down to the cub's level. She gently touched its head, and for the first time, the cub didn't recoil. Instead, it allowed her hand to rest there for a moment before nudging closer to her, seeking warmth, seeking comfort. But something about the way it moved, it was almost as if it knew what Sarah would do before she did it. The cub didn't just follow her instincts. It seemed to anticipate her actions with an uncanny familiarity. The unease she had been feeling earlier surged back. These cubs weren't behaving like abandoned wild bear cubs. They were too accustomed to human contact. Sarah's suspicions deepened. The next morning, Sarah called the local wildlife rescue center again, her voice steady but filled with the questions she couldn't ignore. She described the cubs, their behavior, their unusual calmness, and the overwhelming sense that something was off about their situation. The person on the other end of the phone, a woman named Rachel, listened intently and then paused before responding. "This is strange," Rachel said. "Bear cubs are usually found in the wild, orphaned or abandoned for various reasons. But this is unusual. I've never heard of 6 cubs being left together in such a way. Where exactly did you find them?" Sarah explained the location again, and Rachel's voice became more serious. "I need you to be careful. It sounds like these cubs might be part of a larger problem. Sometimes animals are bred in captivity for the illegal wildlife trade, and occasionally people abandon them when they realize they're not able to care for them properly or when they've been taken from the wild in ways that harm them." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She had never considered the possibility. The cubs, who were already so gentle with her, who didn't struggle against her hands, could have been bred for purposes she didn't even want to think about. The idea of them being sold, exploited, or treated as commodities filled her with a rage she didn't know she could feel for these innocent creatures. "Do you think that's what happened to them?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "That someone was using them? That they were part of something much worse?" Rachel hesitated. "It's hard to say, but I think you need to bring them to us for evaluation. There's a chance they've been exposed to trauma, either physical or emotional. I'll have a team ready to help, but you need to act quickly. If they've been part of a breeding operation or some kind of exploitation, we need to intervene now." As Sarah hung up the phone, a sense of dread settled over her. She had given these cubs a home. She had cared for them, fed them, and comforted them in their fear. They had already become a part of her life, and to think of sending them away now, to be evaluated, possibly taken away from her forever, felt unbearable. But Rachel was right. She couldn't ignore the possibility that these cubs were not the innocent creatures she had believed them to be. If they were part of something darker, something dangerous, she had to act now to protect them and to protect herself. The cubs were in danger, but so was she. Sarah walked into the living room where the cubs were playing. They were rolling on the rug, tumbling over each other in a rare display of joy. But even as they played, their eyes were cautious, always watching Sarah with an intelligence that unsettled her. She knelt down and watched them carefully. They seemed so innocent, so full of life. But that nagging voice in her head was louder than ever. What if they were part of something more sinister? What if they were not meant to be here? The next morning, Sarah called Rachel back. She had made her decision. "I'm bringing them to you," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "It's the right thing to do." As she carefully loaded the cubs into the back of her car once more, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what she was doing. The cubs, once so fragile and dependent on her, were now becoming more independent. She could no longer ignore the possibility that her love for them might have been misplaced. She had offered them her home, but in doing so, she had unknowingly placed them in harm's way. But as the cubs looked up at her from the car, their eyes filled with confusion, with innocence, Sarah's heart broke. She was letting them go, but not because she wanted to. She was letting them go because it was the only way to ensure they could live without fear, without being part of something no creature should ever have to endure. As Sarah drove away from her home, the cubs safely nestled in the back of her car, she couldn't help but wonder. What would happen to them next? The journey had only just begun, and the truth was still hidden, lurking beneath the surface. Part 3. The Truth Unveiled. The drive to the Wildlife Rescue Center felt longer than it ever had. The air was heavy with tension, and Sarah kept glancing nervously at the cubs in the back seat. The cubs, now settled into the car, had fallen into a strange, uneasy silence. Their soft growls and occasional nuzzles into the blankets she had provided were replaced with an almost unnatural stillness, as if they were sensing something far deeper than she could understand. Sarah's mind raced. She had done everything she could for these cubs, given them the warmth of her home, fed them, and made sure they felt loved. Yet now she could no longer ignore the truth she had been trying to push away. The cubs' calmness wasn't natural for wild animals, and their early behavior had raised so many questions. What was their true story? When Sarah finally reached the Wildlife Rescue Center, she could feel her heart sinking. The building loomed in front of her, its sterile appearance a far cry from the comfort of her home, where she had spent the past few weeks bonding with the cubs. But she knew it was necessary. The cubs needed professional care, and the answers Sarah so desperately needed could only be found here. She carefully carried the cubs inside, one by one, to a spacious holding area where other wildlife could be treated. The cubs were carefully placed in large enclosures that offered them space to move around and get comfortable. Rachel, the wildlife expert Sarah had been speaking to, met her at the door. Her face was kind, but there was an undercurrent of concern in her eyes. "You've done a good job, Sarah," Rachel said softly, "but now we need to learn exactly what's going on with these cubs." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard as she watched the cubs settle in their new enclosure. Their eyes were wide with curiosity, but something about their posture, how they sat, how they looked back at Sarah, made her heart ache. "There's something wrong, isn't there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I can feel it. The cubs. They're not like other wild cubs." Rachel's eyes softened. "You're right. Something isn't quite right with these cubs. They've been through more than what we've seen on the surface." She paused before continuing. "Let's find out exactly what we're dealing with." Hours later, Sarah sat in the rescue center's small office, waiting for Rachel's return. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation. She couldn't stop thinking about the cubs, wondering if they were being examined, whether Rachel had discovered something new. When Rachel finally returned, her face was grave. "We've done a full evaluation," Rachel began slowly. "The cubs, they weren't abandoned in the traditional sense. They were raised in captivity." Sarah's stomach turned. She had feared as much, but hearing the words out loud made it feel so much more real. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were part of a breeding operation." Rachel's words hit like a thunderclap. "They were bred for the illegal wildlife trade." Sarah recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. She had known there was something off about the cubs, but the depth of the truth was overwhelming. She had opened her heart to them, offered them safety and comfort, without knowing the full extent of what they had endured. Rachel continued, her voice steady but filled with the weight of what she had uncovered. "These cubs were taken from the wild, illegally, and raised in captivity by people who were likely trying to sell them for profit. They were kept in unnatural conditions, trained to be tamed, but never allowed to live as wild animals. When the people in charge of them realized they couldn't profit anymore, they abandoned them on the highway." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. How could anyone do this to innocent animals? The pain of knowing that these cubs had been exploited in this way was almost too much to bear. "But they were so calm," Sarah whispered, trying to make sense of it all. "They didn't act like wild cubs should. They were like they already knew people." "They did," Rachel nodded somberly. "These cubs have been exposed to human contact from a young age. They've been raised to see humans as caregivers, not threats. But what's worse is that they've been deprived of the opportunity to develop naturally. They don't know how to fend for themselves, how to survive in the wild." Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to process the information. She had thought she was helping these cubs, giving them a better life, but now she understood the truth. These cubs had never had a chance to live the way they were meant to. Their natural instincts had been dulled by captivity, their wildness suppressed by human hands. She thought back to their quiet demeanor when she found them, how they had sought comfort in her touch, how they had allowed her to care for them without fear. The cubs weren't wild creatures anymore. They were victims of something far darker. And now Sarah had to face the painful reality that the love and care she had provided them with might not be enough. "What will happen to them now?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll take care of them," Rachel reassured her. "We can rehabilitate them, help them learn to live in the wild again. It will take time, but we'll do everything we can to make sure they have a future." Sarah's heart ached. She had done everything she could, but now it was clear. These cubs didn't just need her love. They needed to learn what it meant to be wild again. They needed to find their true place in the world, far from the cages of humans, far from the exploitation they had suffered. "You've given them a second chance, Sarah," Rachel said, her voice soft but sincere. "Not many people would have done what you did. You gave them love when they had none. Now it's our turn to help them learn to live freely, as they were meant to." Sarah stood up, her legs shaky but her heart resolute. She had known the cubs for such a short time, but they had become a part of her healing journey, of her hope for the future. The road ahead would be difficult, not just for the cubs, but for her as well. Letting go of them, even knowing it was the right thing to do, would be the hardest part. But Sarah also understood now. The cubs had never truly belonged to her. They were meant for the wild, meant to roam the forests, to live and grow as they had been born to do. As she turned to leave the room, her heart heavy yet filled with a sense of peace, she whispered softly, "Go, little ones. Live the life you were meant to." And with that, she knew. She had done all she could, and it was enough. The days following Sarah's decision were filled with mixed emotions: grief, hope, and a quiet sense of resolve. It was one thing to acknowledge the cubs' need to be wild again, but another to accept that they would no longer be in her care. She had nurtured them, had seen them grow stronger, and the bond she shared with them was undeniable. But Sarah knew that the true gift she could give them was freedom, their chance to reclaim the life they were meant to have. The Wildlife Center's rehabilitation process for the cubs was not easy. They were physically healthy, but their emotional scars ran deep. Sarah visited often, watching the cubs slowly adjust to their new reality. At first, they were tentative, unsure of their surroundings. Their world had been confined to the small, safe spaces of Sarah's home, where the wild had been kept at bay. Here in the wilderness, it was a completely different world, a place full of dangers and of life lessons they had never learned. The staff at the Wildlife Center, under Rachel's guidance, began working with the cubs immediately. The goal was to prepare them for the wild, a task that would take time and patience. The cubs, though healthy, lacked the basic survival skills that a wild bear would need. They didn't know how to hunt, how to forage, or how to protect themselves from the dangers that lurked in the forest. Rachel and her team began by introducing them to the natural environment slowly. They brought the cubs to a large enclosed area within the reserve where they could roam freely without the immediate threat of predators. The cubs were hesitant at first. They stuck close to the humans, following them around as if expecting to be fed or pampered. But slowly, Rachel and her team began to remove themselves, allowing the cubs to explore the area on their own. The first night the cubs spent in the enclosure was a turning point. They seemed lost in the vastness of the space, pacing back and forth, unsure of where to go. But when Rachel returned the next morning, she found that the cubs had made their first real attempt to scavenge for food. They had torn at some bushes, pulled up roots, and tasted the wild fruits that grew there. Though they weren't yet self-sufficient, the cubs were beginning to find their footing. It was a slow, often painful process, but Sarah could see the changes in them during her visits. They were growing more confident each day, shedding the fear and uncertainty that had once ruled their lives. Their playfulness returned, though tempered by the realization that the world they now inhabited was not the comfortable, predictable space they had known in Sarah's home. Weeks passed, and the cubs grew bolder, more curious. They began to exhibit natural behaviors, digging for insects, climbing trees, and marking their territory with the powerful swipes of their paws. They were learning to interact with each other in the way wild cubs do, sometimes rough, sometimes playful, but always full of instinct. On one visit, Sarah watched as one of the cubs, a sleek black bear with an inquisitive nature, climbed up a small tree and tested its balance. For a moment it wavered, almost falling, but then it found its footing. The other cubs watched, fascinated, as if they were learning from him. Sarah couldn't help but smile. This was the bear she had always hoped they would become, the confident, wild creature, reclaiming its place in the natural world. But there was also something bittersweet about watching their transformation. As they grew stronger and more independent, it became clearer that their future was no longer tied to her. Their world was out there, in the forests and mountains, not in the safety of her arms. They had come full circle. The most difficult part of the rehabilitation was yet to come. The cubs needed to learn how to survive on their own, away from the safety net of humans. This meant that they would eventually be given more space, real forest areas, where they would be forced to rely on their instincts to hunt and gather food. It was the final test of their transformation. One afternoon, Sarah accompanied Rachel on a trip to the deep forests of the wildlife reserve. This area was much more like the wild than the enclosures the cubs had been living in. It was vast, untamed, and full of challenges. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense, and the sounds of the wild echoed through the air. The cubs had been kept in a large enclosed area that mimicked their natural environment, but now they would be free to roam and experience the world on their own terms. As the cubs stepped into the forest for the first time, Sarah watched their reactions carefully. At first, they seemed unsure, cautious. They sniffed the air, their paws testing the unfamiliar terrain. The forest was alive with sounds, and the cubs, though growing in confidence, were still adjusting. But then, one by one, they began to move deeper into the forest. They went off in different directions, some climbing trees, others foraging in the underbrush. One of the cubs, the smallest but the most adventurous, began pawing at the ground, digging up roots, its claws sharp against the earth. It was the first true sign of survival, the instinct to forage, to gather what nature had to offer. Sarah watched in awe, her heart filled with pride. She had always believed in them, but now she saw it with her own eyes. These cubs, once helpless, frightened creatures, were becoming bears again. The transformation was almost complete. Days turned into weeks, and the cubs grew stronger still. They were no longer the little cubs Sarah had rescued from the highway. They had learned to live as wild creatures, and their bond with the forest was now unbreakable. Sarah knew that it was time for them to go. Rachel had made the decision, and Sarah agreed. The cubs were ready for the final step, their release back into the wild, where they would roam free, no longer bound by captivity or the cruelty of humans. It would be a bittersweet farewell, but it was the only way they could truly live. The day of their release arrived. The cubs, now full-grown, were loaded into transport crates, their eyes wide with uncertainty and curiosity as they were taken to the forest's edge. Sarah stood silently by, her heart heavy with emotion. She had been their protector, their caretaker, their guide, but now it was time for them to return to where they belonged. One by one, the crates were opened. The cubs hesitated for a moment, looking back at Sarah as if to say goodbye. Then, without a second thought, they stepped into the forest, disappearing into the trees, their forms fading into the wilderness. As Sarah watched them go, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The cubs were free now, living the life they were always meant to live. The pain of letting them go was deep, but it was overshadowed by the joy of knowing that she had given them a second chance. She walked away from the forest that day, knowing that the story of the bear cubs would stay with her forever. They had been part of her healing, part of her journey through loss and grief. They had helped her find her way, just as much as she had helped them. The wild had called to them, and they had answered. Now they were part of something larger, something greater than all of them, a force of nature that could never be contained. And Sarah, as she looked back at the trees where the cubs had disappeared, knew one thing for sure: the world was still full of miracles.